Welcome everyone to today's webinar on CI/CD migrations. My name is Zan Markan, and I'm here today with my colleague Brian.
Hello everyone.
This today is slightly different in format than you might be used to in a webinar, because we're trying to do a Q&A interview, essentially, where I am interviewing Brian from his experience doing these migrations throughout the years. So we'll introduce ourselves, bit of background, and then before we kind of go properly into the interview, we will just kind of explain what we talk about when we say CI/CD config, CI/CD migration in the context of CircleCI in particular, so that, yeah, you'll have sufficient background for everything. And yeah, I'll have a couple of questions prepared for Brian, and then we will open the floor for the audience for the Q&A. So if you do have any questions at the moment or throughout the session or at the end, you have this Q&A button here in Zoom that you can press and you can ask, and we will get to you later. If you have any AV issues, if you can't hear us or whatnot, please do let us know. Use chat or Q&A, yeah, to let us know, and we will try and fix it. Anyway, without further ado, as I said, we have two folks here today. My name is Zan. I'm a developer advocate. I'm based in London, and yeah, I get to do cool things like talking to community folks and build demos and prepare cool sessions for you. Anyway, and today I'm joined here with Brian. So Brian, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yep, thanks very much for that, Dan. So I'm Brian. I'm a senior solutions engineer for the EMEA region here in CircleCI, and I'm based in Dublin. So I've been with the company just over 3.5 years now, and that time has been split between my current role on the pre-sale side and my previous role on the post-sale side. So in that role, I was working as a DevOps customer engineer to help our most strategic regional customers adapt our platform. And part of this role included facilitating some of the migrations to CircleCI from our competitors that we're going to talk about today. So following on from this, I want to share from my experience and guidance for anybody who's looking to undertake something similar.
That's awesome. Yeah. So Brian, I'm sure that especially throughout your years as a DevOps customer engineer, you have some stories, like cool stories about config migrations, and yeah, like the challenges that you were facing or something similar. Do you have something you could share, like a cool anecdote or story with us, so that, yeah, the audience gets a nice picture of what's to come in the rest of the session?
Yeah, so one that springs to mind is back from when I was a DevOps customer engineer. So I had helped a fintech company move over to our SaaS platform from their legacy self-hosted Jenkins setup. And that setup was really entrenched into their overall technology footprint. So this was part of their cloud-first strategy. And most importantly, they saw CircleCI as the partner that was going to help them achieve attainment to this strategy. So in terms of a war story, like one particular issue came up related to how Jenkins handles the concept of what we would say in CircleCI is like a primary and a sidecar Docker executor. And from that, how they're going to implement their containerized jobs on our platform. So when they're doing this in Jenkins, they had to configure the Jenkins plugin for Docker, and then they had to create a new cloud for Docker. And when they're deploying, and then their deployment builds would have referenced what would be called the Docker Maven plugin within their POM XML file. And then it created a cloud agent Docker container that we used for the Microsoft SQL Server database that was used in the job. So when they were trying to get this working on CircleCI, they're running into issues connecting to the database container from their custom image, which was the primary executor. And this was due to the public IP address of their database being called during the connection. So I was able to help them resolve this by providing them with some sample, CircleCI code that showed how to use an MS SQL image as a sidecar executor instead of referencing it in the Docker Maven plugin. So what that meant then was that under the hood, this was successfully connecting to the SQL port, TCP 1433 over the shared network address using Dockerized utility. So they were still able to run their class of tests from the same Maven command that they're using in their Jenkins jobs using this approach. And they were looking to replicate this then also for other containers that were referenced in the POM file, such as Active Directory and MySQL. So they asked us about what the best approach for adding these components would be. Like, could they add them within their custom Coretto image, which was the primary Docker executor? But I felt that, thinking it through, like adding additional sidecar executors for this type of pipeline was better, just as long as the primary Docker executor's resource class was sized accordingly to have the relevant compute to cater for the sidecar executors also. So in the end, they defined multiple reusable executor definitions within their Cornetto image. With their Cornetto image as the primary one, and then the sidecar ones were MySQL, Microsoft SQL, Active Directory, etc. So now, after all of that, they're successfully running in production on our solution with this approach, and they have multiple pipelines using this approach.
That's really cool. Yeah, I think it just shows like how a little clever thinking, knowing the platform, and this kind of approach can really simplify essentially the setup that you have. Anyway, now that we've covered this nice little story, hopefully it gave you some ideas of what's to come. Let's quickly, really quickly go through the bits and pieces of the platform that you might or might not be familiar with, whether you're kind of evaluating CircleCI or you're kind of familiar with it. Hopefully this will just kind of refreshen your knowledge of it. Anyway, so CI/CD, the whole kind of software delivery lifecycle. CI/CD is basically everything that happen or like can handle anything that can happen between code being written and pushed to a repo and code being actually executed in some environment, whether that's production, staging, whatever it is. Also, whichever kind of programming or computing paradigm you use. So for example, if you have like a cloud-based API or backend service or a front-end application or a mobile app, like the principles are the same. So from code to production, we need to run a build, we need to test it, we need to verify it, whether that's unit testing, integration testing, kind of combining it with databases, etc. Also running things like security scanning, for example, like static analysis, dependency scanning for vulnerabilities, all sorts of stuff. And ultimately, make sure that everything is deployed and obviously provisioned to the infrastructure that that we want to deploy it to. So, and that's where a CI/CD tool such as CircleCI can come in handy. And yeah, we've talked about config briefly, and so config is essentially the way we tell CircleCI what to do, how a pipeline, a CI/CD pipeline looks like. We use YAML in CircleCI in particular. We basically just put everything in there, like all your workflows, all your jobs. You describe them, what you wanted to do, where you wanted to do them. Like, for example, if you want to use like Docker images, like secondary sidecar Docker images, you just specify everything in the config, and CircleCI will then kind of evaluate and run it according to that configuration. It always lives in this kind of .circleci directory top level in your repo in a config.yaml file, which also means that it's kind of tied to the same commit that everything else is tied to. So you kind of always get the same level of reproducibility. Beside the config, you obviously want to kind of see what's happening with your builds, with your pipelines. That's where the dashboards and UI parts of it coming handy. So yeah, you see all your kind of jobs being run, pipelines being executed. You can visualize like your test results, like durations, workflow durations through time, etc. All sorts of stuff. And also there's a bunch of things that aren't necessarily visible outright. One is the API. So you can do everything that you can do through the dashboard, you can pretty much do through the API as well. So which allows for even more advanced scripting, etc. You can even trigger pipelines with like extra parameters if you want to. And if the kind of web UI doesn't suit you, we also have things like a Visual Studio Code extension, which kind of gives you this kind of pipeline view, test results, etc., from the Visual Studio editor. So yeah, that kind of stuff is all available to you. When we're talking about configuration, what goes in there? So at the top level, we're essentially defining pipelines. A pipeline is what gets triggered in by a CI/CD tool, and it contains a bunch of workflows. And yeah, so yeah, the most kind of elementary part or the atomic part of every pipeline are jobs. Essentially, that's what executes in a given specific environment. So for example, a job will spin up the virtual machine you want, either Linux, Windows, Mac OS, whatever, or a Docker container based on an image that you specified, and then run a series of commands. And they can be like command line instructions. They can be built-in commands like checkout code from a repo, that kind of stuff. And yeah, you basically specify this, and yeah, the way you orchestrate a bunch of jobs, for example, if you have a testing job, a building job, a deployment job, or like multitude of those, you orchestrate them within a workflow. So you say, okay, these can run sequentially, these can run in parallel, and all of that consists a pipeline. Okay, we also have this concept called orbs, which are essentially reusable pieces of configuration. So you can think about reusing jobs in their entirety. For example, there is a Node.js orb, which contains a job for testing a project, which basically install dependencies and runs your npm test or whatever test command you have. They're like orbs for languages, tools like AWS, CDK, Lambda, all sorts of things, which kind of contains either jobs, commands, executors, so you don't have to like rewrite them, redefine it every single time. Helps a lot with kind of making the config and keeping it tidy. You can also have private orbs, for example, if your organization have specific deployment needs that you kind of keep repeating through projects. You basically can create private orbs that aren't accessible to everyone and are only visible in your organization, so that yeah, you can easily use those. Anyway, that was a brief introduction to what we're talking about. And now let's ask Brian a few questions, shall we? First one is obviously, why do you really get on to migrate something? Because we know that companies are very different from one another, but they all might kind of decide they want to migrate CI/CD vendors, CI/CD configurations. So yeah, Brian, do you have any insights into the reasons why, especially like with different industries, with different company sizes? Are they kind of the same usually? Are they kind of different? Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's compare two types of customers I've dealt with first. Okay. So the first one, if you think back to what I spoke about a few minutes ago, the fintech company, their primary motivation was modernization. As I said, they were on a very antiquated Jenkins stack, very heavily in sewn into their tech footprint, so to speak. So they wanted to modernize. and move on to our platform there to allow them to do that. So another company I can think of is an iGaming company, and their reasons for migrating were more cost or ROI driven. Okay. Now, both customers are in very different verticals, but if you think about it, ultimately their underlying rationale is that they were looking to move forward with a scalable solution that is easier to manage. So when you cut through it, that's really the underlying principle that's in common with both and in common with a lot of customers. So every customer wants this flexibility and not just persisting with the same paradigms and the same technical debt. And you could also say that in general, developers want to make an impact and get something done. They don't want to be fighting with tooling. They don't want to be fighting with process, and they don't want to be maintaining environments. So CircleCI is key to empowering them accordingly. We also allow our customers to realize their coding and security standardization goals via our features such as orbs, which I just mentioned, and our new config policies feature. And they are key in today's market. Another thing that needs to be kept in mind is that we have a team of experts that can help customers navigate this transition in a very hands-on manner.
Cool. Yeah, this is a great explanation. So, okay, now we kind of know what the underlying reasons might be. Now let's talk about how do you achieve such a migration? So especially like I'm interested in hearing what would a timeline for migration be or look like in different companies? Do you usually start with like a pilot project in one area and then kind of move to the others, or you're gonna start multiple areas at the same time? How do you go ahead with this?
Okay. So if you look at the playbook that we have for our project migration service, we would assess the feasibility, first of all, of a config migration pre-sales and try to pilot with a small project. So if you look at the way migrations like these used to be undertaken by customers, they usually tended to go for a waterfall or big bang approach. And that's a bit of an anti-pattern for such rollouts nowadays. So what often happened is that big companies would be very overly reliant on external consultants to carry out infrastructure type migrations and do them all in one go within a short space of time. So this approach tended to be very one-sided, and it kind of put the customer in a position where there's no real leader on their side in the model to help them, you know, share the accountability and the responsibility over timelines and the likes. So if you think of it, if I was to use a bit of a metaphor here, right? So think of the I-95 highway in the US that goes between Florida and the Canadian border, and think of then how much traffic would go through a highway like that. So if work needed to be done to upgrade the I-95, you wouldn't just take the whole road out of commission because there's just too many motors dependent on it. So what will be done instead is that temporary redundancy and rerouting be put in place so that any upgrade works done on the road can be carried out piece by piece and the disruption is minimized. So from an importance point of view, you could probably say the same thing about a customer CI/CD solution, like, you know, a platform like this. And the impact of a prolonged downtime during the big bang migration is probably comparable. So as such, we now employ an agile, continuous approach to do these type of migrations, and this keeps in line with SDLC process and methodology. So this approach is a very iterative one. So we pick ambitious teams on the customer side to act as the early adapters for the product and the migration. And then as a vendor, we give these teams the support to facilitate the migration with ourselves.
Cool. Yeah, I love this kind of motorway analogy, because obviously it does resemble. I like the fact that the best practice resembles what you would kind of do in a real physical world scenario. So yeah, now I'm sure you get this quite often, but like, how long will a migration take usually?
Okay, so from experience, I'd say the longest duration of these migrations tends and rollouts tends to be organizational delays. So as our experts try to unwind the complexities of this and simplify the process as part of these migrations, this ends up involving more stakeholders being involved, and then, more investment in this migration tends to happen. So trying to take these as set in stone, but a rough average based on our process for what we would say be a fairly complex type of migration would be maybe one project might take 5 weeks, and then maybe five complex projects might take 4 months, and 10 plus projects might take 9 months. But these are very kind of worst case type scenarios that are based on a law of averages here. So we'd always try and work with customer timelines to trim this, but more straightforward projects, just keep in mind they could be done in a matter of days or hours.
Yeah, so as always, it depends.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Yeah. One other question I had was like, what are some of the most important things that you want to keep in mind when you're starting this kind of migration process?
I would say you have to remember it's not just all about tooling. Process change and the kind of mindset shift that comes with that is just as important, because without process change, good tooling gets ignored. So I would say like knowledge, desire, change management on the customer side are the biggest things you need to factor in, along with the relevant buy-in and the resources being available on the customer side, such as like a scrum master to orchestrate the whole thing. And as I said, those early adapter teams I referred to earlier.
Yeah, it's really great that you touched on this, actually, the buy-in part, because that was my next question. It was like, how, like beyond especially those kind of early adopters, how do you ensure that you have the wider organizational buy-in in like multiple development teams? Because obviously, like, I know if developers like to do something in a way that they're used to, they're comfortable with, it's sometimes hard to change, right? Obviously, we like tinkering, but also we don't want to deal with something that's obviously going to slow you down for a short period of time until you kind of do this migration as you're kind of learning new things. How do you ensure this?
Okay, so one phrase that we would always say, one credos we'd always use here when discussing this topic is that the pain of staying on your current solution must be greater than the pain of migrating to CircleCI. So in terms of that phrase, I would say that articulating the value of CircleCI and how it's going to solve your pain points, as well as emphasizing the assistance that we can offer to help, I would say would be the keys to realizing this. So if you think about it, right, any good vendor is going to help you challenge your thinking and your assumptions, and they're going to help you identify new opportunities within your company. And most importantly, they're going to help you cement your strategy. So any customer we deal with on this needs to work with us to pull in both the leaders, the developers, and anybody else who's really key to this, and really help between us all create an aligned vision of how the customer CI/CD platform is going to look. So we also require the ability to do the things as a product that a customer needs us to be able to do. An example of this would be like, say, a DevSecOps function might say, okay, well, all our pipelines need to have code scanning or code linting like Sneak or, the likes of that run against as part of our of your build, test, deploy process. And if we can do that, that's going to give all the impacted stakeholders the confidence in our product. So say, for example, when you think about the config policies feature that I spoke about earlier on, like if we were to say, to a customer, well, what if teams could bypass tedious manual change review processes or reviews with a policy enforced automated CircleCI pipeline? Like that kind of statement's going to generate a lot of curiosity and interest. especially due to the fact that there'll be a lot of efficiency gains that could be realized. So, as a follow on from that example, like the migration costs and the migration rationale would need to be justified. We would need to help the customer justify that in terms of time saved and the developer productivity that would happen accordingly. And where possible, try to put a figure on that. That's going to convince the powers that be.
Cool. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I think I've got one more question here on, like, I know that I don't necessarily want to go into this kind of bus factor dilemma, but especially with kind of those early adopters, do you rely on them as kind of your go-to people within the organization? Because obviously, are they the most eager folks to try something out, or do you kind of try to avoid it, trying to kind of level up everyone to a similar degree in a similar way? How do you go about this?
So what I'd say is our advice would be to pick a project belonging to what you would say be a very lean or innovative team that doesn't use legacy systems, and use that project to PO to do a kind of a proof of concept with. But it's also essential, keep in mind, to pick what we would call a traditional team that does use the legacy systems, because we want to get multiple perspectives. And these kind of teams are usually going to be the ones from experience that are going to bring the biggest pain to our attention. And if we are able to help get them over the line, it's going to demonstrate to the rest of the organization that real world problems can be solved. So, these kind of teams usually from experience tend to want to see how the innovative team gets on before they migrate. So as I said, involve the two where you can, but I would always start with the lean innovative team, because they'll be the pace setters on the customer side, so to speak. So then after that, we'd advise the customer not to stop after the POC process, because what should happen then is that CircleCI experts, our people, and the experts on the customer side should then be talking about how can these changes be successfully implemented across the board? How can all the projects be moved over? And how could that be done in a kind of what we would call a train-the-trainer model? So a key thing here is that from our experience in the field, keeping CI/CD knowledge in-house is essential for our customers. So hence we go with the train-the-trainer model rather than just doing everything ourselves for the customer, because ultimately in the long run that's not going to benefit our customers. If we having our experts on the post-sale side dedicated to customer accounts, that further removes any single points of failure resulting, if a key DevOps staff leaves a customer, that puts them in a bit of a quandary. So having us dedicated account removes that. And as I said, if we teach the DevOps experts that are there how to do these migrations after working with them on the initial select ones, that's going to have long-term benefits for the customer. It'll keep the knowledge across the board and reduces the impact of any of those DevOps staff leaving.
Well, yeah. So it's kind of like you're basically teaching them to fish rather than
I mean, like if I take
them...
because if I was to take, say, the example of the iGaming company, like they had about what you'd say be 10 different projects, like that would have been very different from, like they had a load of projects, but we agreed to work with them on the 10 different ones, and then everything after that was some variation of that. And it was the same with the fintech company. I think it was like 5 different or 4 different ones. So yeah, exactly what you said. Once we do that, it enables them to work accordingly with their team to get the rest of them over.
I think that's all the kind of questions that I had. But Brian, I'm sure you can summarize what we've been talking about now.
Yeah.
Any takeaways you could share with everyone?
Yep. So if I was to ask anybody on this call to take away 3 points from this only, I would say this: Migrations to CircleCI are an iterative two-way process between yourselves and us, and we have the experts on our side to help you drive these migrations. Second point would be that innovative champion teams are key to the adaptation of CircleCI on your side. And the third thing I'd say is that moving to our platform opens up very powerful ways of working to simplify CI/CD processes and allow developers to be impactful. So developer happiness, developer productivity, and developer experience are top of mind for most software companies. And these always have been and always will be fundamental to our product and its roadmap.
Cool.
So there are the takeaways.
I think we all love happy developers.
Yep. Everyone
So yeah, now let's open the floor to questions. Again, like you have the Q&A feature in Zoom. Please do ask us something. There are already a few here, so I'll go through them now. Okay, first one. How do we encourage teams to adopt our own best practices and workflow processes? I would imagine this is related to the CI/CD best practices, right?
So how do we encourage teams to adopt our own best practice and workflow processes? Well, there's a simple answer to that. So you might remember I referred earlier on to a feature called config policies. And we brought that out specifically to help enforce standards and provide guardrails for developers to produce pipeline code that meets company best practices. So that's really, in a nutshell, what that feature does. Allows a set of processes to be defined at an org level and to be controlled, by the org admin to really either soft fail or hard fail pipelines that don't kind of meet these standards. So say, for example, if you wanted like code scanning to be done, using our Sneak Orb or using Sonar Cube Orb or anything like that, you could create a policy that that enforces that and stop a pipeline running if a developer tried to comment that out or the likes or didn't have it. And same, for example, if you want them to use specific images as Docker images likes as the primary executors for a job, you can enforce that. So it really follows on from the home team of standardization, and as I said, gives the guardrails for your developers to innovate without incurring unnecessary risk for your company.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I need to try this out. I've not played with config policies yet, but I keep hearing good things about it.
Well, we can help you write policies as well, as part of our enablement services. So definitely something to help.
Next question would be, why would we leave GitHub Actions and go to CircleCI? Why would we migrate?
Okay, so we get asked that a lot, and my answer to be this: so CircleCI is a best-of-breed CI/CD solution. It's built to work on the most complex CI/CD challenges at scale. And if you were to take something like, GitHub Actions, like GitHub and other competitors tend to take a broad but shallow approach to DevOps tools offerings. We do CI/CD all day, every day. Our product offers the best mix of control and scalability. And not just being a simple product, we also provide the right guidance for team members of all abilities to do our best work, via our documentation, via our experts, via all our media options and the likes, our online blogs and discussion posts and the likes. So also as a product, we can adapt as a customer's business strategies change, because we have a lot of options around VCS support, resource class sizings, our orbs and other features allow for multi-cloud deployment support. So we as I said, we're top of mind for CI/CD. We have the flexibility to do that, and we're just going to continue to do that, especially as we take on more sources of change and the likes. And as I said, this is a level of functionality roadmap and bringing out the features that a lot of our competitors can't match.
Cool. Yeah. By the way, our roadmap is kind of public, so you can just search for it, CircleCI public roadmap and or product roadmap is called. You see what we're kind of working on. Anyway, so how do you pick the first project to migrate? Do you go big? Do you go small?
Well, I suppose to be honest, Zan, selecting a team with the right attitude, as I discussed, throughout this webinar, is just as important as the size of the project, if not more so. As you always want eager teams who are willing to work through those lengthy org changes that I spoke about as tend to be the biggest delays on these. And if they can highlight their success internally, other teams are going to follow. So, but I suppose to answer your question more directly, like if you purely want to look at project size and if we oversimplify it, then yes, I would say a small one, rather than a completely big non-critical one, would probably prove the migration methodology as part of a proof of concept. And then we can then work, our experts can work with you to determine the best order of projects to migrate as part of our enablement services offerings.
That makes sense. That makes sense. We have one more at the moment. Should two tools be used to run same project in parallel temporarily? Again, I would believe they mean CI/CD tools.
If we interpret it as, I suppose, your existing solution and then CircleCI, I would say yes, as part of our kind of project migration service. You would do both until you reach what we call the run or business as usual phase for that project, because in that phase, decommission of the project on your current CI/CD is going to be carried out as part of that phase, and then adaptation of that project on CircleCI would begin. So any kind of internal process changes, any internal comms and the likes to your development teams to change over to start using that project on our solution, and anything else they need to do to realize that would be done during that. So I would say yes in a very overly simplified way. Yeah.
Cool stuff. I think this is all for now, unless someone kind of asks something in the next minute or so. We are gonna wrap up soon. I just want to add that we will add a few links to things that we talked about, for example, config policies, and there's also a documentation section called migration guides. So you have like different migration guides for CircleCI. If you want to refer to that, we'll add these links to the end of the slides. You'll get the slides in a couple of days. You also get a recording so that you can refer to it later on. Obviously, you can, if you don't have any questions now, you can still reach out to us. Brian, I would say you're the expert, so reach out to Brian with migration questions. It looks like there's no further questions. So I would just want to say thank you everyone for joining us, and have a lovely day.